of you are Hello, everyone. I know quite a few of you are joining us today. I'm Jean Wainwright. I'm going to be having a conversation with Mark Power today, which I'm really excited about. Just very quickly to introduce myself, I'm an art historian and critic and professor at the University for the Creative Arts. But what we're really here for is to hear about the fantastic book and project, The Shipping Forecast. But I wanted to just give a very brief introduction to Mark. He's a Magnum photographer. He was nominated in 2002, became a full member in 2007. He's worked in the charity markets and editorial markets for 10 years before 1992, when he then became a teacher and then a professor at the University of Brighton. Many of his works are in museums and galleries, and he has a really good website actually where you can see lots of examples of his work, so do have a look afterwards. And he's in a lot of important collections, but I think it's really important about his books and his bodies of work. He's published 15. The Shipping Forecast was first published in 1996 and it's just been republished, but he has done some other ones that we may touch on very briefly, particularly ones like Mass, perhaps, because an investigation into the power and wealth of Polish Catholic Church is actually speaking from Poland, and Good Morning America, which I think is really important. He published Volume 1 in 2018, Volume 2 in 2019, Volume 3 has been published, and he's working on Volume 4. It's aimed to have 5. So without more ado, I think I'm going to go into the questions. So first of all, Mark, I wanted to start with a bit of a kind of childhood question. Quite a lot's been made that you discovered your father's enlarger when you were small, but I wanted to ask about the kind of photographs, accidental or not, that your father took and what impression they made on you.
Yes, well, first of all, hello, Jean, and hello, everybody. I have this is very strange because I have absolutely no idea how many people are out there in Zoom land, but welcome all of you. The odd thing is that when I do live talks, and of course we don't do as many of those as before, there's always, within 10 minutes of me starting, there's always a gentleman who falls fast asleep on the front row. So at least I don't have to deal with that. Yeah, let's go. So thank you for that first question. So my dad was, he was an engineer. He wasn't a photographer as such. He was an amateur, absolutely an amateur photographer. And for him, photography was very much a science. And he was in the Merchant Navy as part of his national service. And what I discovered many, many years later, you know, in my 20s probably, was this little packet of, or little box of 6x4-inch prints that he'd made on board his ship when he was 2 years in the Navy. And it was a kind of Becher-like typology of oil tankers, because they were sailing around the Gulf. As that's where they were. That's where they were asked to be. So all the pictures had these tiny oil tankers in the center of the frame that were, you know, you had to look quite hard because they were always a very, very long way away. And always the horizon was dead center of the image in a very Jem Southern way, you know, like, because Jem always, you know, makes the land and the sky equal, which is very eloquent. And the horizon, of course, was dead straight. And I think that was the engineer in him. And I was really fascinated by this because, of course, he didn't know anything about the history of photography or typologies or anything like that. So it was entirely accidental. But yeah, I discovered this enlarger in the loft of our house, and I said, "What's this?" And he has some developing tanks that he hadn't touched for, you know, decades. And I do remember going out with him with his Voigtlander camera, which we loaded with 35mm film. And I took absolutely dreadful pictures of the surface of tree bark. I mean, you can just imagine. But that didn't matter in a way, because I think it was the alchemy of going home and processing the film. I mean, and then making the prints. Anybody who's, and I'm sure that most people who are watching this have been through that very process, and it is like magic. And I was hooked at that point, although I didn't study photography at art school. I didn't have that kind of trajectory in my mind. I just thought it was such an interesting and wonderful science / art that and let me just turn my phone off. That's very, very unprofessional. But yeah, that was my dad's influence. But there are pictures in the shipping forecast, which was my first major project, I suppose, where the horizon is very intentionally very wonky. So I think it probably, intentionally or not, I think it was my sort of rebellion away from that very precise the very precise nature of my dad's work, or dad's early, I wouldn't say work, but his way of making pictures, which, of course, ironically, anyone that knows the work that I've done since the shipping forecast, where I almost to the day when I finished the project in 1996, I bought myself a 5x4 camera and worked on large format ever since. So I have become extremely precise, almost like an engineer. But the shipping forecast was a kind of a rebellion against all that, I suppose.
Now, obviously, work doesn't come from nowhere. And you did mention as well that you didn't train as a photographer. In fact, I know that you painted a few stormy landscapes as part of your fine art, let's say, career. So there was an interest, there in the sea. But I wanted to draw you into really what first drove you to this huge project. I mean, you weren't making work like that before you did this. So what was the kind of lead up to the shipping forecast that you first did?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because I think that is really key to any young photographers who are sitting out there watching this. I think the lead up to making that first book, The Shipping Forecast, the original version, was very much about risk taking. In my early career, if I could call it such, I was doing very political work based in the UK. It doesn't matter what I was doing, but it was very sort of political, and I thought that photography could change things. But the problem was that financially I was going backwards. I was just pouring more and more money into making these projects that I cared about, but nobody wanted to publish them. It was a difficult time in the late 80s to get that kind of work published anyway. And then just there are so many stories here, and of course I'm talking about a 10-year period in my career in about 3 minutes. But I was in Berlin when the wall fell, entirely by accident, entirely by mistake. And because of that, I was suddenly jettisoned into this other career altogether, where it seemed that it appeared that I had my finger on the pulse of what was going on in Eastern Europe, because nobody saw the fall of the Berlin Wall coming, and I happened to be there, and it looked like I'd sort of predicted it, but of course it wasn't like that. But then I fell into this kind of media career where I was working for newspapers. I worked a lot for the Sunday Telegraph, 2 or 3 days a week. And I did a lot of work for the Sunday Times and the Independent and the old Correspondent magazine and the Observer, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I did that for 2.5 years, and it was great. And I used to have lots of stories to tell at dinner parties. I noticed I got many more dinner party invitations in those days than I do now, because I haven't really got anything to talk about anymore. But I used to have, I was often sent on quirky little stories like Michael Jackson lookalike competitions or bus spotting conventions and daft nonsensical stories. So it was always fun. But I reached a point in '92 where I thought, this isn't for me. This isn't what I dreamed photography would be for me. And so I left altogether. I just quit working for the media, and it corresponded with this opportunity to start teaching in Brighton on a brand new course called editorial photography. I mean, there's an irony there as well, of course, because there isn't much of an editorial market there existing anymore, but there was a course then called editorial photography, and I was a good shoe-in for that, I suppose, because I'd been working in that market. And standing in front of the students, they were only first-year students because it was a brand new course, but standing in front of them for the first time, I realized that I really had to lead by some kind of example, by making a long-term project myself. I wasn't really doing anything. I'd spent 2.5 years doing day jobs, basically. So that's where the shipping forecast began. And of course, it's a kind of a well-known story now, but for those of you who haven't heard it, I saw and bought a tea towel in a Royal National Lifeboat Institute shop in Great Yarmouth in the late 80s, probably 89, 90. And that was
While you're looking for that, I'm just going to remind everybody, I didn't at the beginning, at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A. If you want to ask questions, could you put it in the Q&A, and at the end we'll look at it for the last 15 minutes and ask those questions to get Mark to answer them. Sorry, Mark,
absolutely.
Back to you.
So this is a map of the shipping forecast sea areas. I'm holding up to the screen here, and the tea towel I bought looked a little bit like this. It was a sort of version of this, and what this map shows is the 31 sea areas that feature in the BBC broadcast that at the time was broadcast 4 times a day on the radio. Now, I'm guessing there are, by the way, some people who are watching this who probably don't even know what the shipping forecast is. So I just should it's a forecast that exists to save lives. So it warns sailors who are at sea or about to put to sea that let me just lose myself here. I'm talking to myself. That's better. So it warns sailors who are about to put to sea of impending weather, of bad weather, storms at sea. So that's its function. But of course, within British society, it actually represents something greater. This idea of us being an island nation buffeted by wind and waves perpetually. So listening to this lilting, beautiful, poetic language that describes the weather or the forthcoming weather in these 31 areas, which in themselves have very beautiful romantic names, is very evocative, and it entered public consciousness. So on the odd occasion when the BBC have threatened to take it off public radio and put it in somewhere, broadcast it from some kind of more obscure location, if you like, there's been an outcry from the British public about this. So I'd grown up listening to the forecast. And then so when I saw this tea towel, which had a map on it, it was the first time that I'd ever thought or considered that these sea areas were real geographical locations, that they actually existed in real space. Of course they do, but I'd never really thought about it because it had just been like kind of this wallpaper that had been in part of my life, all since right back through my childhood. So finding the tea towel started me thinking about, it's a long time ago, but maybe first of all, of course, I found it very, very interesting. But if you think about this, I have to then make a leap from a tea towel, which is a map, through this idea of a radio broadcast, which exists in a kind of abstract space. It's not literally visual. And so I had to sort of get from that to in the end, this, which was the first book. So the idea of making pictures about a radio program is quite a strange thing to do. So anyway, I thought it through, and I thought, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought it might have legs, because those 31 sea areas with these beautiful evocative names that I mentioned, I realized that I had built up in my mind since as far back as I could remember. So I've been listening to this forecast, not professionally, but it had just been there, that if somebody said Sea Area Finisterre to me, I had a kind of a mental image in my head of what that place looked like. And I thought, that's the key to open the door to this. Because if I then travel to Sea Area Finisterre with this image in my head of what I think it will be like, very importantly, by the way, not doing any research whatsoever in books about what I will find when I go to that place. So I go to Finisterre, for instance, and the other 30, with an image in my head, an imaginary landscape, and where the clash between what I expected to find and what was there, the myth and the reality, met each other. There was a kind of creative spark, and that's what made it work. It seems really simple now, but it was quite a big leap of faith to make that happen. Now I live in Brighton, which is on the south coast of England, so it touches Sea Area White. So I was able to walk out of my front door, go down to the seaside, and take a few tentative pictures and try and work out a kind of language that I was going to use, because that's very important when you start a new project. You have to think about the kind of camera you're going to use, because the format is very important. In those days, you had to decide if you're going to work in color or black and white, because it's not like today where you can just desaturate everything. It was that was a big choice to make. You had to just consider who your influences were at the time, which all fed into this idea of what kind of pictures I was going to make, because it had to, in the end, I'd already thought logistically about this. This is going to take me a long time to do. So I have to make a decision about the kind of language I'm going to use and then stick with it. I can't just waver off and change the aesthetic halfway through, because then I've got to start all over again. So that's sorry, that's a very, I can't even remember what your question was.
That was a great answer, because it covered quite a few questions. But for some people listening, I think it's really important, listening and looking. I think it's very important to stress that you were working with an analog camera, not a digital camera.
Yeah.
And obviously with that, you know, every work you do, every film you put in is quite costly. You're using film. I just wanted to kind of think about that for a moment. A long project took you 4 years. So you planned it. I wanted to ask about like using film, having to compose the image in camera, those kind of things that you had to do with when you're working analog.
Yeah, okay. So, well, of course, it's very important to remember, isn't it, that when we were all back in the day, when we were all using film, we had no idea what the future was. We didn't, the idea of digital photography was just didn't exist. And so, in a way, our attitude to using film is very different from now, where it's that conscious choice you make to use film instead of digital. There was nothing else you could do. Now, there was a cost implication. I was processing all the film myself. I was making small work prints myself in my darkroom. So it wasn't too bad cost-wise, but nevertheless, that was part of the equation, and I had to think about that. So I think I've always been quite disciplined in the way that I work. I'm quite I'm quite adept at making visual choices quickly. I don't mess around too much. I walk into a space. Over the years, over the 40 odd years I've been doing this, I'm now able to see the world as a photograph. I can see the world in 2 dimensions, so I can imagine what this space in front of me would look like when photographed. And because I use very few lenses, I know exactly what coverage I'm going to get. So I know if I stand here, the picture will look like this, even without looking through a camera. So that's kind of an important process to go through, I think, to feel comfortable with your equipment so that it kind of disappears, I suppose. Anyway, I didn't feel the urge to, if I found myself in a particular situation, to take 50 pictures of it. I would just, often if it was a landscape that without people in, I might only take 1 or maybe 2 pictures of it, just in case the negative was, scratched or something. I would take more if there was if there was people in the pictures who were there was a kind of choreographing that I couldn't control, if you like. I suppose that's the way of putting it, that I didn't know what was going to happen next. I couldn't predict anything. So I would be very careful to probably take more in that instance. There is another thing here, another point here though, that I've been working for the press, as I said. So, I'd done a lot of celebrity portraits, and I'd done a lot of photographed prime ministers, and often only with 3 minutes to do something. It was really, really good training, that to be confident enough to say that's the picture. But of course, the other really important thing when you use film is you can't see the result. You can't. So nowadays, of course, we can look at the back of our camera and think, oh yeah, we got the picture. But there is a danger, of course, in that, in being too easily satisfied. So I learned while working for the media that one should work a situation, that you don't really know what's going to happen. So if you're in a really good situation, you work it. Now that's kind of, I'm sort of contradicting myself a little bit, because when I was working for the media, I was, all of that was paid for. But nevertheless, if there was something going on in front of me that was particularly interesting, I would work it to a certain extent. I'd just take fewer pictures. And then, because also I have to process the blooming thing. So I'd rather process 3 rolls of film than 30. and so, and I've kept that discipline all the way. Obviously, when I moved to large format afterwards, I was even more frugal with the amount of work that I would make. And now I work on a digital equivalent of a 5x4 camera, but I've kept that mentality to not make hundreds of pictures just because I can, because it's free. So I think that's very important too.
There was another couple of points. You say that you left some of the most inaccessible ones to the end, and you actually got a rather ironic grant. And I say ironic for a very good reason. So perhaps talk about the challenges of having to continue a project when maybe you've got to go to inaccessible places, and it's quite difficult.
Yeah, well, I was existing on my university salary, which was £500 a month, I remember, for my 2 days a week. And that was, and we didn't have children then, but, that was basically the money I had to survive on, to pay my rent, to pay my food, and to do this project. So I spent a lot of time writing letters, trying to get sponsorship. I managed to get some free film out of Fuji, which was very kind of them. It's free advertising now. And also AGFA gave me some paper and chemicals towards the end of the project, so that it gained momentum. It was published as a work in progress in several magazines over several pages. So the Independent magazine, for instance, published it twice, each time over 10 or 12 pages, as I was actually making the work. So again, it was like a ball of tumbleweed. It was growing and growing. And so it became easier for me to approach Fuji for some free film, etc. But yes, you're quite right. I left some of the more inaccessible or more expensive places to reach, like Iceland or the Norwegian coast, or even going down as far as Morocco, which touches onto Sierra Trafalgar, as it was called then. So I left those till the end, and there was also a couple of sea areas that I couldn't reach by public transport.
Because you were going in a camper van, weren't you? For
I was traveling on the, there's so much to cover here. For me, it was very important that even though the forecast exists to save lives, so its prime reason is for sailors at sea or fishermen at sea. I was a very, very keen dinghy sailor, by the way.
Yes.
From a young age. So I had this love and respect for the sea. So I was sort of slightly in between two camps here. But if we take that out of the equation, I wanted to make work that was about the experience of listening to the forecast as a kind of landlubber, for whom it didn't really matter. I like the idea of making a project that was sort of nonsensical, that didn't really mean anything. I love that idea. Again, that was a response to making work for the media where, okay, I was doing Michael Jackson lookalike competition sometimes, but I was also doing some quite serious news as well. So the idea of being able to make something that was quite frivolous was really fun, and so I got to a point where I didn't have the funding to be able to reach some of these more inaccessible places, which I wanted to get to by public transport, because I didn't want to go on any trawlers or anything like that, because that wasn't what the work was about. So it was, most of the work was made from the land to places that I could easily get to. I could reach as a member of the public, I could get there. Or they were on public ferries that crossed certain sea areas. So for instance, let me just turn myself on again, so to speak. Here we are. So here, I'm looking at this back to front, but this journey across here between Newcastle and, this is odd because it's completely back to front, between Newcastle and Bergen in Norway, crosses through about 4 different sea areas. And I made that trip several times. So I was able to photograph in some of these, what's called pelagic sea areas, pelagic meaning an area of just sea only, not land, from a ferry or on a ferry. So not all the pictures either contain the sea literally in them. There are pictures that refer to the sea. I made a picture very, very early on in the project, which was of a line of twitchers, bird watchers, who were facing me, but I had the sea behind me, so they were looking at seabirds. And on the right-hand side was a dog sitting down wearing a life jacket. And you could see from the pebbles on the beach that we were on a beach, and there was a dog with a life jacket, so we're near water. And it was a clue that we were by the ocean. And that was, it's not in the book, but it was a revelatory picture for me, because I realized that then I didn't always have to point the camera towards the sea. I just had to refer to the sea in some way, which opened up a whole other lot of possibilities. So on a ferry, I could make, let me show you an example.
There's one called 40s, which is inside, it's an interior.
There's many, but here, this is Sea Area Viking, which was on that very ferry going between Newcastle and Bergen. And this is a picture of a man he's a bingo caller. So, we're all playing bingo. But here if you can see here, you can see the sea is reflected onto these curtains behind. It's very subtle, but it's there. So that's the kind of thing. Anyway, so public transport, no money. I've got two strands to this story. One is that I had to ask a very kind person at the Met Office who was providing me with these forecasts. I've got to stay on message here because I'm getting confused. Underneath each picture is a shipping forecast, and that means that this picture was made in Sea Area Thames. The date of the picture is underneath, and then beneath that, in this case, westerly backing southwesterly, 4 or 5, increasing 6 or 7, occasional rain, good. It's in English, but it doesn't really mean anything to most people, but it's beautiful, nevertheless. Somebody at the Met Office was very kindly providing those to me, and that is the 6 a.m. forecast as broadcast by the BBC on the day the picture was taken. So there's a correlation between image and text. That's very, very important. But I didn't have to get up at 6 o'clock and listen to the forecast and write it down. I made the pictures, and then if I thought I had interesting pictures on these particular dates, I would write to him and he would very kindly send me the forecast. So I had a friend in the Met Office, and they organized for me to go in a Met Office research plane, which is an old RAF, was an old RAF Hercules. I don't know what I'm doing here, but this is a wingspan. It was an enormous plane that flew at 50 feet above the sea, mapping world weather. So it flew, and probably still does, flies around the world, mapping weather. So basically, this happened, then this happened. So now, we've recognized that sequence from before, so we can predict that this will happen next. It's that kind of thing. So I was able to hitch a ride on this plane, and I won't be able to find them now because it's all mixed up. This is the new version. Oh, this picture here on this one is as of Sea Area Bailey, taken through the window of the Hercules aeroplane. And of course, I was over Sea Area Bailey, where they flew me to very kindly, for about 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So it was very fleeting, but I had to make it, so it's not a great picture by any means, but it's a picture of Bailey on that day. So there's that. So the other thing was the money. So I applied to the Arts Council for a grant to help me finish the work and to exhibit the work and to put some money towards a book, and I failed. I like to think, the positive side of me likes to think that in 1996, when I did that black and white documentary work wasn't particularly fashionable, perhaps, and that's why I didn't, these things come and go. So I didn't make it. I didn't get any money from that, and it was terribly disappointing. And I was really at a loss to know how I was going to get to these far-flung places that were expensive. And then I was told at the last minute, like with a day to go, about this new prize for European photography called the Mosaic Prize, and it was based in Luxembourg. Now, Luxembourg is a landlocked country. It doesn't have a coastline. So whereas the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, they all have their own version of the shipping forecast, interestingly, Luxembourg doesn't have a shipping forecast, because why should it? So I thought, well, I'm not going to win this, am I? Because this is a conceptual project about a radio program in Britain about, say, the sea, and this is conceptually going to completely pass them by. And lo and behold, I went and won the prize. So I got this phone call from Luxembourg, or actually from Paris, one Monday morning at about 8 o'clock in the morning. I got the phone went, and they said, congratulations, you've won $25,000. And of course, that just changed everything. And I was able to finish the work, to have the exhibition, to put money into the book, which And that's what made it all possible. So, you know, it's my favorite country in the world, Luxembourg. I love it. I've only been once, but
What, to pick up the check?
but yeah, so that's the story of how there's a lot of luck and a lot of fortune in my career. I just, like being in Berlin, like winning that prize against all the odds. I think a lot of those prizes, I don't really enter competitions anymore, but it's so much about, and getting into Magnum as well, is so much about the right time to apply for these things. One day you might be up against 20 absolutely astonishing people, and the next year you might not be, and you don't know. And so I was very lucky. But as the proverb goes, fortune favors the prepared mind, which I've always believed in.
Now, I wanted to talk about editing, because
Mhm.
with books, it is so important, the edit. And obviously there was a first book that had far less photographs than the second one. Can you talk about the difference between the decisions you made and the edit for
Yes.
the first book, and then the much extended and enlarged second one,
Okay.
even down to the decisions made on the cover, for example?
Yes. Okay. So let me talk. So this was the first book that came out in 1996. Now, on the back here for book numbers, the fact that there are 4 quotes here tells you that it's not a first edition. This is a second or third edition. First edition only has 1 quote on the back. So when this book came out, I had been told by an esteemed publisher, and he was right, that at the time in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, most people who did a half decent photography book would sell 700 copies to other photographers. So we were sort of buying each other's books. But most people would be publishing about 2,000 copies. And which is why, Jean, I'm sure you remember all those wonderful, wonderful remaindered bookshops that were everywhere, where you could just buy a fantastic library for next to nothing, because there were all these books that they couldn't get. So anyway, we printed 2,000 copies of the first edition, and out of nowhere, the Observer newspaper made it their book of the week. Mm-hmm. And the first edition sold out in 10 days entirely of its, and we did 1,700 hardback and 300 softback. And the 300 softback were really only intended for the catalogue for the exhibition. So that was the idea. And the softback was £16.50 and the hardback was £19.95, I think. So, and so clearly, and then we did a second edition of 3,000 hardback, which again sold out very quickly. Then we did a third edition of, this is all relevant to doing the second book, but I know I'm going a little off piste here, but I think it's quite important to say this. The third edition of another 5,000 softback, of which this is probably one, and that also sold out. So there were 10,000 of these sold. And so it had got out of that photography ghetto, if you like, and had reached a whole other audience of people who didn't buy photography books, but they bought this one because of the subject matter, because they were radio listeners, and because it gave them pictures of these places for the first time. Now, that upset some people, by the way. I got some really nasty letters from some people saying I'd, in effect, destroyed their radio dreams, that they had these imaginary landscapes, and then you went and gave me pictures, and I can't remember what I thought anymore. So that anyway, it came out. It sold a lot and sold quickly, but it then became quite a cultish book, because it was quite hard. University libraries, art college libraries had it. But it sort of went into a lot of suburban homes, I like to think, and it ended up on a bookshelf and nobody ever thought about selling it because they didn't know there was a secondhand market for books. And this book became more and more and more expensive. So it was a weird thing that there were a lot of copies out there for a photography book, but many people, particularly young people, hadn't seen it. So the original edit is, I think, 60 pictures. And the reason it was so sparse is because in the 90s, that's what we did. We didn't do books of this new version, which is 163. So you can see the difference in thickness here. We didn't do books like this in the 90s because it would have been, seen as utterly pretentious and like a coffee table book and all of that. Maybe it still is, I don't know. But so I wanted to edit it down into something very, very tight, with a maximum of 3 pictures from any of the 31C areas. So that was the first rule I had. All 31C areas had to be in the book. So if there's 31C areas and about 60 pictures in this, there's approximately, on average, 2 pictures per C area. I'd worked on this project for 4 years. I'd got 1,197 rolls of 120 film, 12 pictures on a roll. So I had 14,004, if my maths is right, 14,400 pictures I'd taken, condensed down to 60. So I was bound to get some good ones because of so many. But that was the way we did it in those days. And anyway, this book then, it sold, it was gone. And it became a piece of history of its kind. And then during COVID, during the second lockdown, I was thinking maybe I should publish it again, because it was coming up to 30 years since I started the project. It was coming up to 25 years since the first book came out. So it was a nice like peg to hang your coat on. So during the second lockdown period in the UK, I went back to my contact sheets and I started to mark up pictures that I'd completely ignored before. And I made about 500 scans of the negatives, and then I made 500 12 by 10 digital prints. And this pile on my desk of prints just grew and grew and grew and grew. So it would sit on my desk and I would look at it and I think, I don't know where to start with this, because it was just so overwhelming. Not only were there a lot of pictures on the contact sheets that I rediscovered, because there'd been such a gap between making the work and then looking at it afresh 25 years, 30 years later, that there were a lot of pictures in those contacts that I didn't remember. I never thought I would get to the stage where I forgot pictures that I'd taken. I couldn't believe that. I don't remember going to that place or taking that picture or seeing that thing. You know, we think about photographs as being, they're kind of aid memoirs that you remember the event and you remember what happened before and after. So for the maker of the picture expands into real time, whereas the viewer only gets to see this split second. And that's, you know, that's the wonder of the whole thing. But I'd completely forgotten. Anyway, so I made this big pile of prints, and that's when I had to. I decided. So Stuart Smith at GOST, who's published many of my books, said he would really like to do this. He was right behind it. So that's the point when Stuart and I got together for the first time in his house in Blackheath. And the first thing we did was we put those prints all over the floor and we walked on them. In our socks, not our shoes, but we walk on them to kind of distress them a little bit. And Kodak, my dog, was able to walk on them and sleep on them. And so there's a lovely video of Kodak just sort of collapsing on and going to sleep on these prints that are covering Stuart's floor. The reason you do that is that you've got to make those prints less precious.
Well, that's a really interesting point, you saying that, to make the prints less precious. Why?
Well, because I have this beautiful, immaculately made a set of prints that were all, you know, trimmed to the same size, and it looked gorgeous, but they're a working tool. And I said to myself, do I want a pile of prints, or do I want a new book? And the way of doing this is to not be precious about them, so that we walk on them, so we can sort of throw them around and move them around and not worry about them, you know, getting damaged, because I can always make more. So that first day with Stuart, it just broke the back of it just got me back into the flow of it again, and not understanding it, because I'm very I've got a lot of experience of editing and sequencing my own work. I do it all the time, but this was particularly unwieldy, and I needed Stuart's input just to say, don't panic. This is what we're going to do. We're going to do it bit by bit. And I don't know if any of the pairings that we made on that first day still exist in the actual book, but in a way that didn't matter. It just made me think about how I might put it together. So the increase in 100 pictures was because I didn't want to make this. I didn't see any point in making this book again, because it was already out there in big numbers, and it wasn't interesting for me to do that. What was interesting was to go back and reassess the work. So in a way, this book is the book of the shipping forecast, because it was about time and place, you know. But this book is much more, I think, about the celebration of the project. So it's not so precious as the first one, and I just went. All these ideas I can't go more than 3 pictures per shipping area. It went out of the window. So there are some areas in this book that have 10 or 12 pictures representing them. And then that one picture from Sea Area Bailey that I showed you before, taken from the aeroplane, is still the only picture of Sea Area Bailey. So there's one picture of that. And I think that's fine, because it's a different beast. But I would say that and this is quite important for me, is that I consider these to be different books. I consider this to be my first book and this to be my 15th book. It's the same work, but they are totally different. And so it's about, this is where it becomes about bookmaking, that it's not about the work anymore, it's about the object. And the objects are so totally different that I feel in my heart that they're different books. I mean, obviously. You can see here, by the way, this is, I wanted to pick up this blue here. It doesn't look so good on the camera, but it's quite similar, this blue in this, so that it sort of nodded back to the original. And also the first picture of the first book, it begins with this picture of Sea Area White. It's just a picture of land and sea and sky. And the last picture, and this is Sea Area Finisterre, are repeated in the new book. So that it has the same bookends, if you like. Mark. This picture of Finisterre, by the way, this is kind of important, and this has to be the last picture, because in medieval times, when pilgrims would walk the Santiago de Compostela, the famous pilgrimage, they would walk to Santiago de Compostela, the Camino de Compostela, it's called. They would walk to Santiago, and then often they would walk on another 15 kilometers or so to the town of Finisterre, which is on the edge of the Spanish coast, on the top left-hand corner of the Spanish coast, top northwest corner. And they would gaze out from this very spot that I'm standing here, and they would gaze out at the horizon, because in those days nobody knew that the world wasn't flat. So they would look out at this horizon thinking that that was the edge of the world. And Finisterre, of course, in Latin, Finisterra means edge of the earth, end of the world, if you like. So it's a very poignant picture to put last. It's the obvious picture to put last. Now you have to know that, and it doesn't tell you that in the book, but it's a nice little story and a nice reason to put it at the end. So it remained the same. So anyway, Stuart and I we realized we quickly realized that we had a lot of pictures, and we didn't really want to be dictated by the weight of the book, or any of those other technical issues. The book was going to be what it was. And so this book is 240 pages, and the new version. So let me find a spread. So this is a spread. So the book is 240 pages. A spread is 2 pages, just to be clear about that. That's not 1 page, that's 2 pages. Or rather, that is not 1 page, that is 2 pages. So if we have 240 pages and 163 pictures.
Well, that's a great picture that you're showing at the moment as well.
Thank you. We've got 120 spreads, basically. And if I wanted to get 163 pictures in there, that means I have to double up. I have to make some pairings. Plus there's essays at the back. Plus there's the colophon. There's all the other stuff. There's the map. So the pairings themselves become very important. And then what's important when you sequence a book is the pacing of it. So you can't, this is very much what Stuart has been teaching me over all the years, is that there are single images on a spread. So it starts with a single picture, then another single picture, and then a spread, a double, and then I think we had a rule that you couldn't have more than 3 single pictures on their own in a sequence, and you couldn't have more than 3 pairings on their own. I think that's what we did, because especially with the pairings, there's just no space, and you do pairing, it just becomes monotonous. And so, but there's no formula to this. So the important thing is when you turn the page, you really don't know what's going to come next. You don't want to think, oh, I get it. It goes single picture, double picture, single, double, single, double. It doesn't do that. It jumps all over the place. But it has to have a kind of flow like water, I suppose. And
it definitely does. Mark, I'm aware that we're 1852, and
I can't have talk when I get going. I am sorry.
No, it's fantastic and fascinating. But there are quite a few questions.
Okay, just very quickly though, when you pair pictures together, I mean, this is completely random. I just opened this and found this pair, but there has to be a kind of dialogue between the 2 pictures. So you might think that you get, I'll put these 2 strong pictures together. That can often cancel each other out. So it's not about that when you're sequencing and you're making pairings. The pictures have to almost create a 3rd picture in between. They have to sort of bounce off each other, inform each other, and I think improve each other. So that's what, and of course here as an example, the fact that the horizon follows through is really important. The light here is very similar. They're both backlit. And they're bright and high key. So that's important. So that's the kind of thing I was doing over and over and over again. And it took months and months to put this together. It really did. But I feel that it flows pretty seamlessly from the first picture to the 163rd. There are links. There is a reason why every single picture follows another. There is a reason why every pairing is together. So it's not, it might look a bit random.
Yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the questions, because I think there's some great questions here. Okay. And then it would be lovely to just, we've been told we can run a bit over, which is fabulous. So we can just talk about some of the, some images that were challenging, or particularly looking at them, you thought, God, they've got to be in. So The first question is from Roger Jardine, who says, what camera and lenses did you shoot the shipping forecast on, and what film did you shoot it on?
It's a Mamiya 6, which is a rangefinder camera. I think many people have been more familiar with the Mamiya 7, which is a 6x7. So 10 pictures on a roll of film. So it's 120 film. The Mamiya 6 came out first. It's a wonderful camera, but it had a tendency, it had bellows in it, and you could close up the front of it. So it was you couldn't exactly put it in your pocket unless you had very big pockets. But it was a very lovely camera to use. And I'd never worked with a square format before. The film, by the way, was, well, obviously Fujifilm after they started giving me free film. But it was, I think I started with Ilford HP5, and then so it's a variety of things, which causes a few problems about making it work together because they've got different characteristics. But it's a rangefinder camera. It's quite big and plastic looking, so it doesn't look very serious. And the rangefinder, of course, means that you don't see precisely what you're going to get. It's a little bit hit and miss. But it's like using an overgrown Leica, I suppose. You know, there are reasons for that. You see the framing in the viewfinder, and you see the edge around the frame. So it's very good for when things are coming in and out of frame quickly. And in this book, there are a lot of pictures of people doing, as typical. I come to one where there's nobody. But believe me, there are lots of pictures where people are coming in and out of the frame all the time. So that was quite important. And it's a very fluid camera to use. It's very hard to get the horizon straight, so which is, it's a very spontaneous camera. When I look at the work now, which I can do fairly dispassionately because it feels almost like the work of somebody else, it feels like very much a young person's work. It's full of energy. I'm in my 60s now. I just couldn't do that anymore. Joseph Kudelka, by the way, he once said that all photographers make their best work before their 40th birthday. There's a degree of accuracy in that, but I wouldn't completely agree with that. I think your work changes, and in Kudelka's case, since we were talking technical things, he realized with his early work, and the gypsies, the exiles, all of that, that amazing work that he was doing, that he couldn't keep making that work as he was getting older. He was probably trying, but it wasn't quite as good as it used to be. So he moved to his panoramic camera, which was much more contemplative, and he continued to make remarkable pictures, but aesthetically they were very different, a very different way of working, very much slower, because you're getting older and you look at the world in a different way. So it feels like the work of a young person, helped by that camera.
There's quite a few questions about focal length. So
oh yes, sorry, I had a 50mm and an 80mm. I only had two lenses, so the 80 was a standard and the 50 was a wide.
There's also yes, so there was also someone who said, do you use the Mamiya 6 on a tripod? Was it on a tripod?
No, absolutely not, no.
Yeah. There's an interesting question here. Do you think Magnum is a futuristic business model still?
Whoa.
That's probably
futuristic.
Somebody could dig.
Sure I understand the question. Do you think we will survive as an agency? Well, I hope so. It's touch and go all the time. Of course it is in this modern age, but that's way off piece. But the thing about if one was to start an agency like that these days, you wouldn't have an office in London, Paris, and New York like Magnum does. That's ridiculous for a new business in the modern age with computers. When Magnum started, that didn't, that was the only way you could do it. So that business model, if you like, is old-fashioned, and yet there are distinct advantages to having offices in different territories, I would say. So there's no right or wrong way of doing this.
And this one's from Jackie Chapman. Who influenced your style, photographers or artists?
Well, for this book, so when I started as a photographer, I knew far more about the history of painting and sculpture than I did about photography. There is a nice little story I could very quickly tell you about going to see a Mark Rothko exhibition when I was in my final year at art school. And Rothko, the very great Russian-American abstract expressionist painter. And I'd been taught how to look at a Rothko. You have to focus your eyes behind the surface of the painting. And then if you do that and you get in the right kind of frame of mind, the painting starts to move. It's kind of an optical illusion. You have to know how to do it in order for that to happen, to get beyond the surface, if you like. I went to that and I got all the wobbly paintings and it all worked for me, and that was great. And then I came out and I had a copy of Time Out London, and I thought, I've got some time, I'll look what else is on. And I'd only heard of two photographers at that time. There was Bill Brandt and Don McCullin, and there was a McCullin show on. So I thought, I'll go and see that. So I think it was at the South Bank, and I went in there, and it was in many rooms. And I found myself in a room with a middle-aged woman, but I'm 20 years old or something. So I'm in the room with this woman, and she's looking at the pictures and she's crying. And now I'm making a huge leap here, but she could have been crying, of course, because she could have been crying for any number of reasons. But in my mind, I like to think that she was crying because the pictures spoke to her. It was the room, I remember very clearly, about Biafra, the famine in Biafra, which was some of McCullin's most powerful, iconic pictures. And I felt she's really deeply moved by photography. And let's just take another leap. Let's just assume she hasn't been trained to look at pictures, look at photographs, but they are moving her to tears. And so if we take all that as read, on the one hand, painting, you need to, of course, you don't need to know how to look at a painting, because it's not, art isn't about that, but it helps sometimes. And I like that. I'm going to use a really horrible overused word now for photography, but maybe it's more relevant than ever. The democracy of photography, the way that it speaks to people because it's so close to the truth, really appealed to me. And I think that's where the spark was born. So to answer that question, in the early days, I was probably more influenced by painters because I simply knew more about it. But when I started the shipping forecast, which was 10 years after I decided to become a photographer. I mean, that's how long it takes, by the way. If you're starting out as a photographer, mustn't expect to have success overnight. It takes a long time. But this work was very influenced by Tony Ray Jones, early Martin Parr. I mean, Martin confused me. I didn't know Martin at the time, but he confused me because he'd moved to colour. There was all that new British colour photography, and there's me stuck in the past making work in black and white. There was a reason for that, though, because I wanted the nostalgia of black and white. I wanted the romance of black and white in this work. I don't feel that if I'd made this work in colour, it would maybe not have lasted so, or maybe not have done the job I wanted it to do, evocatively. And then, of course, Chris Killip, absolutely. Yes. Still, In Flagrante is still my go-to photography book. It's the book I've looked at most in my career. In Flagrante came out in 1988. I started this work in 1992, so 4 years later. And I knew the book inside out by then. I wanted to be Chris Killip, and I never was. But deeply influenced by that. Raymond Moore as well was another one, who was a gentle landscape photographer working in the northwest of England. Not so well known as the others, but certainly someone to check out.
There's quite a few I'm grouping together here. So Inga says, very glad to listen to your very interesting presentation. The editorial part was very insightful. I just wanted to ask if you worked all the time alone or if you had assistants. And then do you use any flashes, filters, or other accessories to achieve the aesthetics of your photographs?
If Inga's talking about the early work before I started this, no, I never worked with an assistant. No, I didn't. There was never the kind of budgets for that kind of thing. Not the sort of work I was doing, which was very editorial. So I would always work alone, and it was a really good. It was this work. I mean, Jo, my now wife, was with me a lot of the time while I was making this work, because we would go on holiday together and I would make pictures, but I was very often on my own. You know, we would separate, because you can't make this kind of very spontaneous work when you're talking to somebody else about what you're going to have for tea. I mean, it doesn't work. So you have to be in the zone. I love photography for its solitariness. I've just come back from America, where I've been for 3.5 weeks on my own, and you end up talking to yourself because you just, you know, but that's what you have to do. I mean, I think it's a solid. Photographers often are a little bit socially awkward, I think, because they're drawn to the solitariness of it, of the profession. You know, I think you choose to be a photographer rather than working in a film crew, which is very much about community and working together towards a final goal. Photography is a lonesome activity.
She's also asked whether you use any flashes or filters.
There's a couple of pictures in the shipping forecast which have got flash in, like this one. I can't see myself in there, but this one here has got flash and this one hasn't. I mean, you know, I think you get away with it much more in black and white than in color. It's more obvious in color. So yeah, I carried a small Vivitar 283 flash gun with me and put it on when I needed to.
Lee Johnson's asked a provocative question here. Do you think the shipping project or forecast is a type of photo project that would get published today if it were a new project, of course?
That's a very interesting. I know Lee. I think he was on one of my workshops once. So hello, Lee. So I was interviewed about the new version, by a young journalist from the British Journal of Photography. And he came to my studio and he was saying to me that he doesn't listen to the forecast. He knew what it was. He'd done some research about it. He knew what it was, but it wasn't like our generation, Jean, where it would be on all the time, because he said, I listen to music and I listen to podcasts. So if I want to listen to the shipping forecast, I have to go and find it. It's not, I don't have Radio 4 on all the time, you know. So I think it's not as ubiquitous as it used to be.
It's not.
So in a way, we're taking a little bit of a leap of faith with this, that this is going to speak to anyone. I mean, I like to think that the people who bought this would buy this because it's so different. That's the hope. But you know, I think this really sounds awful, like I'm blowing my own trumpet, but this book was talked about a lot. But as I said before, an awful lot of people hadn't seen it, and I think that's kind of why I wanted to do it again, because I don't like the idea of being, you know, making something that no one can see anymore. I think that's just ludicrous. So so I would like to think that it would still get published, because I think the work stands up. I'm going to say something now which I'm going to regret, but I have said this in other interviews.
You're on camera.
I have said this in other interviews, so I think it's fair, because I'm being honest now. When I went through the work again, one of the things that struck me was that I was a lot better than I thought I was at the time. and I hope that doesn't sound pretentious. It's when I was making the shipping forecast, I was really full of self-doubt. I thought the work was terrible most of the time. I didn't, friends would tell me that it was, that it was good, it was going in the right direction, but I was so self-critical the whole way through, which is probably a good thing. And when I went back and looked at it much more dispassionately, I realized that the breadth of the work, the quality of the work I was making was much better than I thought it was. So to answer Lee's question, I think that if I'm allowed to say, I think the work's good enough to stand. If it's about the work, then I think, yes, it would get published again, because I think it's good enough to get. That's really terrible. But I think it's good enough to be done again. There is still an audience out there, of course, that maybe people under 25 don't listen to the forecast, but I think people in their 30s definitely did and would know what it was. Yes, the answer is yeah. God, that's a long-winded. Yes, it would.
There's an interesting one here from Pam Isherwood, who says, I hope, Mark, you'll mention the exhibition at the gallery, now gone, that showed the pictures with sound clips of the broadcast. Multimedia before it was called that. And actually on that point as well, the cover of the new book with the white lettering reminds me of how you frame your work with the shipping forecast, the information etched onto the frame. So there's a direct relationship there with the cover of the book and how you frame your work.
Thank you for that. It's lovely that people still talk about that show, which I still have, by the way, in crates in my studio, so it's all ready to go out again. But it traveled to, I think, 22 venues, which again is remarkable. So there were big prints that I made myself, and the forecast, the text was etched onto the glass, as you rightly say, Jean. It was then in box frames, so that when you shone a light onto the glass where the text was,
it's a shadow. It
made a shadow. If you had two lights, it made two shadows. So it talked about the ephemeral nature of the weather, because you can't predict what will happen. Well, no, you can't. It never lasts. It always changes. So there was that, and then there were 16 Roberts radios. Roberts radios are a British institution as well. They were almost exactly the same age as the shipping forecast, so they must be 100 years old now. They gave us 16 radios without any gubbins in, so apart from just the speaker. And then I worked with Mr. Miller and Mr. Porter, who did kind of TV theme tunes, but they were, this was their chance to be like, to do their Brian Eno. And so what they did was with the BBC's permission, very important, they sampled 100 different forecasts, split it up into parts, and then a computer would randomly choose. There are basically, in a forecast, there are 4 parts. So the computer would randomly choose part 1 from this forecast, part 2 from this forecast, part 3 from that one, and this one. Always with the same reader, though, so it didn't shift. We had 3 different readers: Charlotte Green, Brian Perkins, all these names from the past.
Yes.
So it would invent forecasts, and there were, yes, exactly, and there were over 1 million possible forecasts that the computer could sample from these parts, and then it moved between the radios. So it would move randomly between the radios in the space, which was a lovely, really lovely sort of 4-dimensional feeling that you had. And then there was also a sound installation of sounds of that you would hear by the coast. So there would be children playing on the beach, the clanking of a chain of an anchor coming up from a ship on that kind of thing. So there was this sound. The idea was to turn, and then rain. There was perpetual rain and wind. So the idea was to turn this into a kind of atmosphere that you recognized.
Now
almost like you're in your living room.
we could really pursue that, but I'm going to get through some of the other questions because, of course, the difference between a book and that exhibition, you know, where you're having atmosphere as well.
Yeah.
But Anna Fox has asked an interesting question. Could you say more about the value of working with great designers? Does it become a collaboration of sorts?
Yes, yes. Stuart would be very pleased about that question, Anna. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, I think I'm in really good hands with Stu when it comes to the design of the book. And also Stu is very, very good at putting pictures together, but we are always in disagreement about that. He's publicly said many times that I'm the most tricky person to work with because I've got very distinct and definite ideas about what I should use and in what sequence and so on. So we fight a lot, but it's always friendly, and I think it's a good process. I think if you're entirely on the same page, it's a little bit easy, and but Stuart speaks his mind, I speak my mind, so we get to it's a collaboration. And I'm talking now specifically about the editing and the sequencing. And when it comes to the design, with this book, I kept saying to Stu, where's the design? We're going on press in 2 weeks' time. I haven't seen a cover yet. This is typical of Stu and GOST. I haven't seen anything. Where, you know, and he said, oh, it's coming. And then I was sent 4 versions of this cover. And he didn't say anything more. He just sent, and he said, just tell me what you think. And I loved this one, which has just, these are forecasts that occur in the book. But they take in virtually every kind of weather, or, you know, all the lovely words. So it's got the word good in it. It's got the word occasional, which it's got all it as showers and backing and veering, and so it's got all the right vocabulary in it. And then on the back is my name and the name of the book. So you see this on we used to worry about what a book would look like in a photographer's gallery. You know, you'd have to sort of design it so that someone would pick it up, or, you know, what did the spine look like, because that was, you know, otherwise no one would ever take it off a shelf. We don't really need to think about that anymore, because most people, of course, are buying books online. So, you know, and they're seeing videos of the inside of the book. So it's a very different experience. But anyway, it came through and I loved this one. And he said, that was the one I like best, but I thought you wouldn't go for it. Because it was the subtlest of them. It didn't, you know, I love that, but I love the fact that it's meaningless. You look at that, and if you don't know what the shipping forecast is, you think, what is that? It doesn't sing photography book. It doesn't have an image on the front like this one has an image. That's a whole other story, by the way, but I probably don't have time to talk about the picture on that, but that's a whole other story and a fight with another publisher. Not Zelda, by the way, but I won't go.
Glad to hear that.
Longer story. But I hope that answers the question, and I'm very fortunate I have very, very, I'm really interested in photo books. I'm really interested in the design of photo books, and I buy a lot of books and I look at them a lot. And so the design is key for me, but the design has to be appropriate. I don't like books that are over-designed unless it's appropriate. So both the designers that I've worked with recently, it's all about paring back, and, you know, making it as only having things in the design that need to be there, because ultimately you don't want to destroy the work. You don't want something over-designed so you can't even get to the work. So the page layout in both books is extremely simple. And it didn't need any more than that. So
still got questions coming in.
That's fine. I'm not going.
So if everyone's happy, we'll just carry on. it's now nearly 6:20, but we'll carry on because there's some great
Okay.
questions coming in. Somebody has asked about working with square format and
Mhm.
saying that that's not normally for landscape, and why perhaps you chose that.
Okay, so I hadn't worked with a square camera before, so I had to learn how to use the square. And it's, when you start out, it's very exciting because it's like nothing else. And you don't have to think about this or this. You don't have to think about portrait or landscape because it's a square. But it does mean that you don't get much width, but you do get a lot of ground and sky. So it swings and roundabouts, but it kind of suits the work for this, because there are things coming in from the bottom, the top, the sides. It's you know, it's about filling the frame, organizing the frame so that it works. Having said that, after 4 years, I was absolutely sick of it. I thought I'd done everything I could with the square format. I just bereft of any other ways, any other ideas of using it. And so when I see someone like Jerry Johansson's work, who's made, you know, who's stuck with his Rolleiflex for decades, and there's a repetition in Jerry's work, certainly, but there's a lot of imagination, there's a lot of invention in those pictures, and so it can be done. And dear Peter Marlowe, who sadly is no longer with us, was a master of the square as well. I mean, he did things with the square that I've never even thought about. And so, but I worked with the square for 4 years on this. I worked out a kind of way of making pictures, which I suppose was quite successful. But then I just threw it all away and started using 5x4, which is totally different. And I completely changed my language, because it just felt like, you know, towards the end of making the shipping forecast, I was looking at a lot of American and German large format work. I was really obsessed with it. I wanted to make work like that. I didn't want to make work like this anymore. I wanted to make work like that. So that was the reason I switched afterwards. But I was just following my heart, my intuition, and it doesn't make it right or wrong, but it was right for me.
There's another great question here from Robin Caddy. I really enjoy seeing the work that you share on Instagram during your
Thank you.
USA trips. Truly work in progress. Does sharing the work in this way form part of your process or play a part in informing the finished book?
It's a very good question. I actually wrote quite a lot on my last USA trip because I was so lonely. I did some quite long posts where I wrote about why I use Instagram, among other things. I wrote about vulnerability and, you know, that all of those ideas of, you know, feeling, are you doing the right thing? Is this going well? Is this, you know, all of the self-doubt. But I also wrote about why I used Instagram. For me, and I'm talking specifically now about when I'm away working in the US, I'm posting pictures from the day before. So I make my work in the day, I go to my hotel room, I download, I do all that work in the evening from that day to a point. I don't take it too far because I'm only using a laptop when I'm traveling. But and then I make JPEGs and I post maybe 2, 3, 4, 3 pictures, probably maximum, the next day from the previous day. Now, I'm trying things out. It's one of the main reasons I do it is because when I'm thinking this is, you know, when you're working every day for, as this last trip was, 25 days, every day going out searching for pictures, it's very easy to lose sight of what you did earlier on in the same trip. And you can really get yourself in a quandary where you think, oh, I've lost all my talent. I can't make pictures anymore. And then you can just pick up your phone and you can look what you post on Instagram. and it's in the last 3 weeks or 2 weeks that you've been on this trip, and it can be very, it is encouraging because oh yes, there's that, I did that and I did that, and what I love is coming home from the States and sitting on the plane and looking at my phone and looking at the pictures I might have posted 60, 70 pictures from that trip. And so I can look at them and think, okay, so what's good enough there to actually potentially make the next book? Because when I go on a trip to the States, I'm thinking before I go, if I can come back with 12 usable pictures, I'm happy. So I'm looking through Instagram and I'm counting the ones that I think, yeah, although I'm very close to it, of course, I'm only on the plane coming home, so I can't really make any decisions, but it helps with that editing process. And I love also the sharing of the work with an audience when I feel like it makes me feel far less lonely. I was getting fantastic advice on where I should go, so if I was in Connecticut, someone from Connecticut would say, you must go to this place, and I would go, and 6 times out of 10 it was great. Sometimes it wasn't, because some people misunderstand what I'm looking for, although I don't really know what I'm looking for, but sometimes it's fantastic, and so I feel it's important, but I don't edit the books according to the number of likes a picture gets, because actually looking back over those Instagram feeds, often my favorite pictures, whatever that means, are the ones that get the fewest likes. Not always.
Isn't that funny?
But that said, if something gets 3,000 likes, it does make you think, maybe I'm missing something here with this. And so that's a good part of the process as well. But I would never edit a book according to the number of likes it gets, because that's a really slippery slope.
There's a question here that actually relates a little bit to what you were talking about, where you said you didn't feel a lot of the work was any good. And this is from an anonymous person. I'm 27 and I keep feeling that young people around me already succeed so much in photography, and I'm missing out on those opportunities to apply for grants and competitions. Comparison issues sometimes stop me from making work. I struggle really to overcome it. Any advice?
Yeah, no, I recognize that. I think it should never be a competition. I mean, I don't mean a competition. I mean, the bigger, you shouldn't be, you need to put all of that out of your head and not feel that it's a competition for one person to be better than somebody else. I think to embrace what's going on and to love what other people are doing and to be inspired by it and to wonder about what photography can do, that's the way to counteract that. It's not be frightened of it or think my work isn't as good, but to think, that's amazing, what can I learn from that? Also, why don't I like certain things is an probably even better question to ask yourself. I don't understand why that's successful, and try to kind of deconstruct it and think about that, because it's all a learning process. I'm not advocating that everyone likes everything. That's ridiculous. We have to have our tastes, but ultimately it is about patience, and it's about determination, and it's about getting out of bed in the morning and getting out the front door and getting on with it, and not worrying too much. Well, we're not worrying about what other people are doing. I mean, if you are committed and if you've got good ideas, your time will come.
Oh, that's brilliant advice, Mark.
It's just nice. That unfortunately too many people fall by the wayside. I just wonder how many amazing talents there could have been, because they were just told no once too often, or they didn't. And then they give up and they do something else. Now again, that's a personal decision, and no one should beat themselves up about that, about thinking this isn't for me. But if you feel inside that you've got that drive, you've got that ambition. I don't mean drive being really all shouty and going out and networking, and I think it's about, because I don't do that, and I've never done that. I've always been, my philosophy has always been to just quietly get on with it, not really try and worry too much about what other people are doing, other than just embracing it and loving it. And so just to quietly get on with it, and if it's good enough, it will have its day. That's what I've always believed. So I hope that helps.
There's quite a few asking about your decision of black and white, but I thought I'd read out Anna's, because it says you work in both black and white and color. Why did you choose to work in black and white for this work? And then question mark, then she said, and disaster re the 40th birthday. I don't know what that is.
Disaster re the 40th birthday.
Birthday.
Who is this?
That's something Anna
I
thought.
deny it all.
Perhaps you didn't realize it was a disaster. To be continued.
Oh, the 40th birthday, Kudelka's 40th, but I understand. Yeah, okay. Well, I did say earlier, you weren't paying attention, whoever asked that, but I did say that black and white was really about the nostalgia and about the romance of the broadcast. I wanted to talk about its history. It felt more appropriate. I also, liked being able to make, process and film and make the prints. And there is that moment in a black and white darkroom, which I really miss actually, where you're watching the image come up in a tray and there's nothing else to do other than just stare at it. And I think that years and years of doing that makes me stare at the picture that I've just made and think, if I'd stood 2 feet to the left, it would have been better. So it was a massive learning. So I've been super critical of the pictures that were appearing in front of me. I know that if I'd been working in color, sending the work off to a lab and getting, it's not the same thing. I felt that relationship with the image as I was actually processing it myself was really important in my learning curve. Not these days, I work exclusively in color. I'm still critical, but I don't need to do that quite to the same extent. But I do spend a lot of time looking at the work I've just made. Even now, I do it all the time. Because I don't think, that's a really important thing to say, is I think for me, you must spend more time looking and assessing what you've done and what you're doing than actually going out and making new work. I don't make new pictures every day, far, far, far from it. I'm really sporadic and, I work in bursts. But then I could go months without taking a picture but it doesn't mean I'm not thinking about what I'm doing and looking at what I've done and trying to understand what it is I'm doing. So I'm one of those photographers that works out what they're doing by the act of doing it. But doing it isn't just this or, this. It's actually looking at what you have done and learning from that.
Now, earlier on in the conversation, Mark, you did talk about this, but this is a kind of extension of that question. You mentioned that you transferred to digital camera. Was there any particular reason beyond what you already said that, that you started working with one that had it imitated, if you like, the analog?
Yeah, there was one very, very, very big reason, which was the sheer cost of working in color on 5.4. It got to the stage where it was costing me £10, which is like $13 US, 12 euros for every single picture I took. And that just was not sustainable. And if I was lucky enough to get a job, I would say, well, can I do it on film? And they'd say, well, the cost of it will have to come out of your fee. So in effect, I'm paying to do it myself, So I would do jobs and make no money out of it because I'd spent all the money on doing the job, making the pictures on. So it wasn't sustainable. So I took out a really silly, stupid bank loan and bought this new equipment that I'd managed to borrow from Alpa for almost a year, and they hadn't asked for it back, and I thought, well, they've forgotten about it, and then of course they asked for it back. So I had to get a bank loan and buy this because I wanted to fall in love with the digital equivalent. It's very important to me to love my equipment and feel like it's an extension of myself. And I'd found this machine, and I wanted one, so I got the bank loan, and just by chance I suddenly got lots of good, well-paid work that paid it off very, very quickly. So I was, again, a fortune, but I made that leap, and I don't have any regrets. I don't miss working on film. I did enough of it.
The same person has asked a second, Mingyi has asked a second part of the question, which I'd like to ask if you would say getting a grant, what is the turning point for you to start your career? I think what they're getting at, does getting a grant kind of propel you more than the start of your career? You know, how much does it propel projects? I think that's what the question's
well, obviously, obviously injects money into what you're trying to do, which is always important. But I think for me, it's a recognition that what you're doing, because we're all vulnerable, and we all need to be told by people we respect now and again that it's all right what you're doing, it's worthwhile. And so I think getting a grant is a kind of a rubber stamp that you are doing something worthwhile. And then if it's the kind of grant that ends in a show, or if you are literally a photographer in residence somewhere, it's a deadline, and deadlines are really good for everybody. This project could have this work could have drifted on for years, and well, it drifted on for 4 years, but it could have gone on and on and on forever. I could still be doing it now, heavens above. But I had to impose a deadline on myself of saying, I'm going to publish a book on this date, and I'm going to have the first show in this date. So I made a deadline, which was entirely self-generated, whereas most grants will give you a deadline. And they also, let's also take that further. You don't get a grant by doing nothing. You have to get a grant by probably making some preliminary work and then spending a lot of time writing a very, very good proposal. And you'll know about this, Jean. I mean, writing about what you're going to do is really important. And it's one of the most difficult things that we do. If you're not applying for grants, you don't have to ever write down anything about, but writing down in words what you think you're doing and why, even if it's may change later on, it's such a good exercise to do. It answers so many of those questions that you don't want to face.
That's a very good piece of advice. Lee Spracklen has said, did you know Ken Loach used the Sailing By tune, which I must say is so evocative, which isn't used anymore. It was used for many years. I don't think it's used anymore.
No, it is. It's still just before the midnight. It's just before the midnight
one. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. When the shipping
Ken Loach used the music, did he?
Yes, they said, did you know that about unemployment and poverty in Newcastle, which makes a nice circulatory back to the work of Chris Killip. And we've got a couple of more questions, and then I think we'll have to call it a day because we're at 7:37. And I realize
my wife is stuck in the room behind me.
Well, we're being hosted
getting hungry,
so London, and I'm sure
I need to release her.
They're probably way beyond, the time we should have finished. So thank you so much. How upset were you when your standard lens broke on this American trip? How did it break? And what do you feel? And do you feel that it was a compromise using the wide? Was it a big adjustment to change the way you saw the landscape? Nice.
Somebody's really been paying attention.
We've been paying attention to your Instagram there.
Yeah, well, I did moan about it a lot. So I use a standard lens almost exclusively in the States, but I have this other lens, the wider lens, that I started the project with the wider lens, then I got the standard. It fell about 10 inches onto some carpet. It was thin carpets, it was hard, but it fell down. I didn't really take any notice because they're really solid cameras, but it just fell in the wrong place. And what's called a copal shutter, it's the mechanism where the lens opens and closes, was damaged. That's the diagnosis after it's been to the camera doctor. That was what I was told was wrong with it. So basically, it fell out of focus. It was in focus in the middle, but it was out of focus on both sides. So I couldn't use it anymore. So I moved back to this wide lens, and I really don't like using it. The wide lens has its own characteristics that changes the look of, I'm going to use the word landscape in its broadest possible sense. You know, it distorts things because the whole point of using the standard is it looks like we see. And I try to make pictures that are particularly without any frills. I do these panoramic joiners, which is, you know, not how we see, but that's a reference to American cinema, but that's another matter. The standard lens, I like to make pictures that look as close as possible to the experience of looking. And the wide lens is not like that. It starts to be more about the characteristic of the lens, and I don't like that. But I had to deal with it, and I know the tricks to make it not look like a wide lens. I know certain ways of working with it that you'd be hard pressed to tell, but I know. And so for 2.5 weeks, I was in the States without my favorite lens, and I've only got two. And countless times I'd be in a place where I'd think, oh, if only, you know, it felt like such a compromise all the time to be forced to use this other one. But it's a first world problem, as they say. And I'm not.
Two more technical ones. When you're working on the road, what laptop and processing software do you use? And also connected to that, another person, what size sensor is your Alpa?
Okay. So I can't show you my laptop because if I showed you my laptop, it wouldn't work, would it? But it's a 5-year-old MacBook Pro, a little bit souped up. So it's got more storage. I use it with 2 external hard drives, so I'm backing up all the time. So there's nothing on the computer itself. I use Capture One, which is fantastic. I can't get on with Lightroom, and that's the processing software I use. And the final question was, the Alpa doesn't have a sensor. You put a phase 1 back on it. So the Alpa is only a camera and a lens. It doesn't take it. That's it. So I use quite an old now phase 1 back. It's 65 megapixels. So it's not huge. They make a 150, which I of course love. But I use that camera in the States. I'm using it in a really old-fashioned documentary sense, that I'm walking around with this camera. It's already expensive enough. I'm quite vulnerable. I'm on my own. I think if I was walking around with 150 megapixel back that costs God only knows how many tens of thousands, I would feel very insecure. I mean, I'm using equipment that is insured. It's not brand new. I hope nothing happens, but of course, you know. So I'm essentially using a camera equipment that an architectural photographer would use or a studio photographer would use. It's not really designed for how I use it, which is part of why I love using it in that way, actually.
Right. Well, I think we're going to draw to a close. I'm really happy to see we've still got 87 people listening, which is pretty good because we were only supposed to do an hour. So thank you all for staying with us.
Yes,
and I just want to thank you, Mark. We could go on for ages. Do look at the book. It's got such fabulous edits, the wonderful trajectories, the way the work works together. It's so beautiful and interesting. And also I want to thank the Photo London team who have, particularly Solange, who has been kind of testing the signals with the lovely technical team as well in Poland to make sure they worked, helping set everything everything up and to make everything go really flawlessly today. So thank you all. It has
Thank
been
you.
recorded if you want to visit it. And particularly thank you, Mark, for being such a great person to interview and
Thank
have
you.
a
Thank you.
conversation with.
Thanks very much, everyone, for staying on, and I see you soon. Bye, Jean. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.